Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RadioWHO podcast on WhoWhatWhy.com. I am your host, Guillermo Jimenez. Thank you all so much for joining me on this inaugural episode of this podcast. I am very pleased to have joined the WhoWhatWhy team. Excited to be producing this new podcast series that I hope you guys out there tuning in will find both informative and enjoyable to listen to. Hey, if you're not already familiar with me and my work and the other podcasts that I host, please do check out the website tracesofreality.com. You'll find links to all my social media pages as well as all the updates on podcasts and video shows that I currently produce and host. That's all over on Traces of Reality. So, now on today's program here on RadioWHO, our guest today is Douglas Lucas. He is a writer, a journalist, featured on a variety of different websites online. He's a reporter here for WhoWhatWhy. Douglas here writes about national security, internet freedom, issues related to the drug war in Mexico, and of course, many of you listening are likely familiar with his work covering the Barrett Brown case. Douglas, good to talk to you again, man. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in your bio, actually, it says you're living in Texas, but I could have sworn you told me you were moving. So what's up with that?
I'm in North Texas for a while, but I do visit New York City often.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right, then. Well, to get started here with the program, you know, I did want to start today with your latest article for WhoWhatWhy. It's titled "Exclusive," and that's in big letters. The counterinsurgency.
We had an exclusive Freedom of Information Act request.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the title is "Counterinsurgency War on and Inside Our Borders." So, I guess before we get into the nitty-gritty and the larger implications of this counterinsurgency war happening along the U.S.-Mexico border, and in truth, it's far more expansive and affects communities throughout America, or perhaps even the Americas. But before we get into all of that, can you start us off with just maybe a brief summary of what happened out in Arizona last month that got a lot of media attention, the incursion between Mexican police and U.S. Border Patrol, and what you discovered when you looked into this and other such incursions?
Right, okay. So in June, there was an incident in Arizona where a Mexican police helicopter crossed over the border, which is called an incursion. They crossed over the border into Mexico, into Arizona, and fired 2 shots near U.S. border agents. And there was some debate about what exactly happened, and the media was sort of freaking out, like, oh my gosh, a Mexican helicopter has crossed into our airspace, they're in our territory, oh my gosh. But what we discovered through this Freedom of Information Act request was that this is a much more routine thing. Mexican military aircraft, not just police, but Mexican military aircraft, entered U.S. territory 49 times from 2010 through 2012, and additional evidence from WikiLeaks shows that it happens even more often than that. Because, how much did the helicopter cross over the Rio Grande or not? Well, who's counting, that kind of thing.
Right.
But it definitely happens. We turned up examples in the WikiLeaks documents where it wasn't on the FOIA document we got from Customs and Border Protection. So it was yet another incident above those 49 times.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the 49 that were admitted, but as you said, there's evidence to suggest that there's been more than just that. And in fact, I can mention just quickly here anecdotally that, I've spent most of my life along the border in Laredo, Texas, and people who live there, I know me and friends of mine, family, the sight of a Mexican helicopter or helicopters at all is not uncommon at all. It's fairly routine, and in fact, they're usually, sometimes they're flying so high up above that you can't quite tell with the naked eye, especially for a layman who's not familiar with this stuff. Like, you can't quite tell, who those helicopters even belong to. So, it's happened many times, and it would surprise no one who lives along the U.S.-Mexico border. So,
right, there was an incident that we didn't get into in this article. We just had the photograph from it, where Texas game wardens actually spotted a Mexican military helicopter crossing over the border. That was in one of the WikiLeaks documents. And in that situation, it was Texas Park and Wildlife game wardens that spotted the Mexican military chopper just northwest of Zapata, Texas, as they patrolled Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake, one bank of which belongs to the U.S. and the other of which belongs to Mexico. So that was that one was on the Customs and Border Protection FOIA document, And I think we narrowed it down, or I narrowed it down to, it was early in the evening on July 22, 2011. So we had some really granular information that was almost certainly when that military chopper crossed over. So it's really remarkable that you have the mainstream media saying, well, wow, this Arizona thing, like, wow, but, it happened. That was just one incident, and it's really
Yeah.
happening all the time. And like you're saying with Laredo, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The WikiLeaks documents
Hmm.
were from the Austin-based private intelligence firm Stratfor, who knew about, who knew and knows about these incidents. Their vice president, Fred Burton, said something like, actually, he said, all the time we fly our birds into Mexico and vice versa. Don't tell Alex Jones or Glenn Beck because
Right.
people will flip out.
Yeah, you have that line in your article, of course, and I know, man, like you said, it does really happen so frequently that anyone who lives in the area would know about it. These people have known, and as you say, continue to know about this. But I suppose the majority of the American public who lives in the interior of the country or the northern part of the country is not aware of these things going on, and so an incident like what happened in Arizona would be quite shocking to them. But I think it's important that you pointed out in this article that, yeah, they should be concerned about it. Absolutely. They should not be surprised by it, I guess, in other words. It's something that happens regularly, and that needs to be paid attention to. And in fact, because of this, because of what's happening along the border. I don't want to move on from this too soon, but just to make that connection that, those people who are shocked by this, say, and again, in the interior of the country should understand that these things are not just border issues, that in fact, because of this counterinsurgency effort that's happening along the border, this is what leads to the militarization of police, and this affects them very, very closely. So, but could you talk a little bit more about some of these incidents? I know you write about one in this article near McAllen, Texas. So can you talk about, what happens, how, perhaps in what way do the U.S. Border Patrol and the Mexican military cooperate to target some of these narco boogeyman bad guys?
Right. Well, in that case, U.S. Border Patrol agents were chasing a vehicle presumably containing narcos down the US 83, and a Texas State Police helicopter was following along by air helping. So you had US Border Patrol being federal law enforcement, and you had Texas State Police being state, and they're both chasing down US 83 following this narco vehicle to the Rio Grande. So the narcos get out and they take their bundles, presumably containing narcotics, in these John boats, which are flat-bottom boats, sometimes used for fishing, and they're really lightweight, and they're the sort of nondescript colors. They make for good camouflage, and they're easy to transport, and so they're good for smuggling drugs.
Right.
So the narcos put their bundles in the John boats and flee across the Rio Grande from the U.S. Border Patrol and Texas State Police chopper. But some of the U.S. forces contact the Mexican military, who shows up with a Mexican Air Force helicopter, and I believe some are Marines on the ground or something. And pretty soon, these narcos are getting attacked by the Mexican military. And I think some of the narcos managed to escape. One suspect was taken into custody, and so forth. And actually, at the very sort of climax of the report in the WikiLeaks document, the the Texas State Police chopper made radio contact with the Mexican military helicopter, and the DPS one, the Texas Police one, guided the Mexican helicopter and ground units to this narco suspect who was hiding in the brush. And then they finished him off there. They killed him, and they have a picture of that we show in the article. The dead body on the riverbank.
Yeah, just so I don't misunderstand. So the dead body on that riverbank, is that on the Mexican side or the American side of the border?
Yeah, that's on the Mexican side.
Yeah.
What happened was the Texas State Police helicopter guided the Mexican chopper and ground forces to him.
Yeah.
Hey, he ran over here, he's hiding over here. They're using radio contacts to do that. So it's really this sort of international warfare going on because the Texas State Police helicopter is basically acting as a sort of paramilitary force.
Right, exactly. And I guess I made the distinction just now about what side of the river that body eventually ended up on, but
right.
It's, I guess, and that's a distinction that I think that's a sort of a natural thing that an American audience would probably, again, that typical American audience would ask. But then again, if you look at this stuff, those distinctions are pretty blurred along the border. What side this stuff happens on really is somewhat irrelevant when it comes to how these agencies function and act. So could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sorry, I lost you for a second.
Oh, okay.
Your question?
Yeah, no. So I was talking about how for the agencies, like the Mexican military, like like you said, the Texas state agencies that were down there, which side of the border this stuff is actually happening on is fairly irrelevant as far as how they work together to for whatever their operation might be detailing.
Well, one of the things the Apollo astronauts, almost all of them said, was that when they look down at the Earth, they don't see the border lines that you see when you look on a globe. And the Rio Grande, it's in reality, it's a river.
Yeah.
It's governments and their corporate masters that are drawing these borders and saying this side belongs to Mexico and this side belongs to the United States, but really it's people in a river. And they're running around one side or the other, and there are rules about, well, the Texas police chopper may or may not be able to fly over this river, and of course, if they do fly over the little arbitrary line that the governments have drawn, it's not like they're going to necessarily report that to the superiors, and it's going to wind up in a FOIA document. Mm-hmm. So it's funny because you've got the physical reality of what's happening. You've got a river, and you've got people going across it in helicopters. And then you have these lines that are drawn by governments that are really arbitrary, and in reality there aren't any border lines. There's just a river. And there's
exactly.
Just banks.
Yep, exactly. And
so that's what you get problems with governments interfering with migrants moving. Mm-hmm. And so you get these immigration lockdowns, and President Obama calling for, I think it was $3.7 billion in emergency border control money, and that's trying to social control and manage these populations. Indeed. Instead of letting them be free.
Indeed, and that's very telling of what how the government and politicians conceive of solutions, right? How can we fix this? Let's see. Let's throw a bunch of money at it. Let's throw four more billions of dollars at it and see how she flies.
In reality, the river flow changes, and the people change, and the people move, and the governments and corporations want to draw these static, unchanging, forever boundaries, and forever this side is this people and these people, and those Mexicans down on that other side, those are different people. They're not what we do. They try to divide and split people apart. When what we really want, we now have this internet. We can have 7 billion people all being part of a commons together.
Exactly. And so I think those two things are very, very much connected. The prohibitions on migration, the prohibitions on drugs, obviously is very connected, and this is what leads to the sort of policies that are enacted in this country to try and control and to try to manage populations, as you said earlier, try to manage migration and migrant populations, try to manage the flow of narcotics. You end up with these gigantic bureaucracies, and you end up with a police force that has been a local police force that's been completely militarized. It's funny because you often hear about how these crazy conspiracy theorists have been talking about martial law being declared in this country for so long, and I'm sort of thinking, well, you know what? You can all relax because it's already here in a way, a de facto sort of martial law state where if you successfully have militarized local police populations for whatever purpose, then I guess you don't really have to declare martial law, do you?
Right. It's sort of again, it's one of those distinctions between the abstract sort of conceptual things that governments impose and the physical reality on the situation. If you just look at the physical reality of the pictures, the photographs coming out of Ferguson, that's an armed personnel carrier, sniper rifles and tear gas bullets. That's paramilitary. if you look at the pictures and you look at it. But then you get all the abstract government rules like, okay, it's really a local police, it's really this, it's really that.
Yeah.
But if you look at it with your eyeballs, like that's a sniper rifle pointed at you.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I think those images have been very, very powerful for that purpose alone, because
there were even on Twitter there were Palestinians that tweeted pictures of tear gas canisters and giving advice to people in Ferguson about, don't use water to get it out of your eyes, use milk or Coke. I think that's what it was. If you have tear gas in your eyes, you probably should check Twitter in Palestine before following my advice, as I've never been tear gassed.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that we've made this connection, I should mention, but it's an important one to make. This, as far as again, in your article, you're talking about the counterinsurgency war that's happening along the border, and so I guess when there's a counterinsurgency, you have the question becomes, well, who are the insurgents? And I guess in that case, we're talking about either these narcos, or I suppose in a way even these migrants could be considered insurgents, because part of this is to again control that population, that movement. But what I found also worth noting is that yesterday or day before yesterday, I saw a tweet by the ACLU pointing to one of their articles by Matthew Harwood, and it's the tweet says, it's a tweet to the article. It says to terrify and occupy, how militarization and police turn cops into counterinsurgents. And so that connection again is very clear, very vivid. And of course that article,
counterinsurgent fighters,
right,
practitioners of counterinsurgency,
exactly. And I guess you have to ask again, who are the actual insurgents there? But anyway, so could you talk a little bit about that though, as far as how, what is this counterinsurgency and who are the insurgents?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what counterinsurgency is. You had classic conflicts. You had state-level armies versus state-level armies, where you're worried about international alliances and nukes, and does North Korea have nukes? And that's World War II. You've got tanks rolling across battlefields. It's even I think it was the first Iraq Desert Storm. You had TV of these tanks rolling across the desert. Large numbers of tanks. And that's sort of a traditional classic conflict of the early 20th century. And then you started to get this counterinsurgency spectrum that was, you had you had militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border all the way back in the 80s. And that's when counterinsurgency doctrine starts, building up its low-intensity conflict doctrine and so on. Okay, so then we jump forward to 2006, I believe, and that's when Petraeus redefined the counterinsurgency doctrine by co-authoring the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And that gives a list of principles about how to fight a counterinsurgency-style war. Mm-hmm. So what you do in a counter is, instead of rolling your tanks across and worrying so much about international alliances and having, the Axis and Allies World War II stuff, you're doing something different. You're practicing counterinsurgency. And so what that emphasizes is, well, you got to find who the insurgents are, and the insurgents are the rebels. So, take the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. We went over there and, knocked the crap out of them. Yeah. Then a little while later, they begin rebelling against our occupation. And those rebels, I think it was Rumsfeld saying, don't call it an insurgency. They're not insurgents, don't use that word, he was telling everyone. Then pretty much they had to quickly admit, yeah, they're insurgents, yeah, they're rebelling, we got to do something else. So they send Petraeus over there with a surge to deploy his counterinsurgency field manual, his new doctrine, his new concept that he came up with. And that involves militarization of police, and that involves the military acting like police. So you have the roles of police and military blurring as the two are trying to control civilian populations. And there's a big emphasis on controlling drug trafficking, because that's where insurgents get a lot of their money. So you have assassinations, you have kidnappings of drug smugglers, you have efforts to control civilian populations, which can include things like joint efforts by civilian agencies and military forces to build infrastructure and manage population. So when you see these pictures coming out of, I guess, a few years ago, you hear a lot of news about, well, in Iraq, we've got, civilian agencies from the U.S. federal government, and we've got water wells for the Iraqi populace. How great is it that we're building these water wells, and now these Iraqis can drink water? Well, really what that is it's this joint effort by civilian agencies and police and military forces to just redesign the Iraqi landscape to make it more suited to a U.S. occupation. So then the military ported this counterinsurgency strategy from Iraq over to Afghanistan,
right,
where they U.S. military began practicing the counterinsurgency strategies there. And then what I'm arguing, in fact, Petraeus himself argued, that this counterinsurgency doctrine should be applied to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Right. Right, and that's exactly what's happening now. And as I said before, you see this spreading, or not. I suppose it was happening at the same time, running parallel. The militarization of American police forces has been happening for a very, very long time. But as sort of in that sort of counterinsurgency sort of framework, I suppose that may be a newer type of phenomenon that's happening now. But again, that begs the question in my mind, anyways, is if you're employing a counterinsurgency sort of operation or strategy, then you have to question, well, okay, well then who are the insurgents and
right.
who's the occupying force here? What's happening? Right. And again, just to go back to those images, I mean, they really say I know it's a tired cliche that an image says 1,000 words, but I mean, in this case, if you've seen those images on Twitter that were circulating from Ferguson.
Right.
They're really quite striking. I mean, as you said earlier, you got people, holding people. These soldiers, these police officers look like soldiers aiming their sniper rifles at people, and it's just crazy.
Having their hands up too.
Exactly, they have their hands up, and it's just right. It's just wild to think that that's acceptable. That is the acceptable role of our police force now in America in 2014. It's quite
right.
wild.
It's definitely not. Who was it? The Barney Frank. It's not Barney Frank, officer friendly on the neighborhood corner. Helping children across the street. Which is what police should be much more about, serving and protecting. It's sort of like you have a science fiction convention. You have a guy who gets too drunk, and he's kind of getting rowdy and causing trouble, and so you have some of the people who are more respected in the community there. Okay, guy, you need to walk down to your bedroom and sleep. And we're going to kind of push you over and walk you over there, and that's policing.
Yeah.
And and you don't need any guns. You just need, the community respects these people. They understand that they have the motives of helping the community in mind.
Yeah.
And they don't have sniper rifles. They just have the respect of the community, and they walk the drunk guy over back to his bedroom. That's police.
To your point, it's funny that the people who ended up doing this in Ferguson were the community leaders themselves. I remember, if you follow, for example, I think his name was Antonio French.
Yes.
The citizen journalist, and also I believe he was
Alderman.
Alderman. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. So he was tweeting about this recently. I've been tweeting about it the entire time, but I think yesterday he was recounting a story of how last night, or I think it was last night or a couple nights ago, things sort of sparked up again. And the police were, sort of inciting once again this sort of stuff, these clashes between protesters and the police. And he notes that what it took was him and a couple of other respected people in the community going up to these protesters or anyone else, or there was some looting happening. They would go up to them and say, "Hey, you're going about this the wrong way. This is not what we're about. This is not what you should be doing." And they themselves policed themselves. They de-escalated the situation.
Exactly.
Basically did what the police is supposed to do themselves.
Mm-hmm. So. And I think that that's something that could be called, there's a political philosopher and activist named Heather Marsh who describes that sort of thing as an approval economy instead of a trade economy based on money, where you have money corrupting and making these corporations that are making borders and bringing back military gear, surplus gear from Afghanistan and giving it to police departments, versus where you have, okay, we have this community leader we respect and approve of, and we're going to let him de-escalate the situation. So it's the trade economy that starts fundamentally underpins, in my opinion, that fundamentally underpins a lot of the problems, including militarization of police. Whereas if you have an approval economy and you have commons and you have sharing, and it works much more like your little bitty science fiction convention where you're taking care of the drunk guy who's being rowdy. It's much more peaceful that way.
Indeed. Something else that I wanted to bring up before we have to close out today is, the other sort of aspect of counterinsurgency. One of the other things that play into it. I wanted to answer
real quick your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Sure. Go ahead.
In the Mexican scenario, I believe that Petraeus and Petraeus himself has argued that here's what he said. He said that the illegal narcotic empires, over time, they erode the rule of law and in many respects, although the Mexican leaders don't like the term, the appropriate intellectual construct for responding is a counterinsurgency construct. So he describes his strategy for Iraq that was ported to Afghanistan, the Anaconda, and you can use it in Mexico against the cartels. The cartels, the illegal narcotic empires, are viewed as insurgents.
Yeah.
They're the rebels. They're the groups of rebels, and which is kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy to look at them through the lens of counterinsurgency, because what they are lethal black market businessmen.
Indeed.
And if you wanted to stop them, what you would do is you would stop the money laundering at the banks that enables the cartels to fuel their operations. That would be the real thing. Is you'd send JSOC after the banks, because you've got for example Wachovia Wells and HSBC were both found to be laundering money, and they get a slap on the wrist because, as Attorney General Eric Holder said, the banks are too big to prosecute, that if we do that, we might harm the economy. I just want to give a quick shout out that a lot of these ideas I get from Timothy J. Dunn, who wrote The Militarization of the U.S.-Mexico Border, 1978-1992, Low-Intensity Conflict Doctrine, which is part of counterinsurgency, comes home. Yeah. He's a Salisbury University sociology professor who does border studies, international migration, and human rights. So a lot of his work has influenced my views on these things.
Excellent. No, it's a good shout out, because I was not familiar with the name, and now I am, and that's
it's Timothy J. Dunn, D-U-N-N.
Perfect. That's someone I definitely want to read in the future. And so one other quick thing about this that I wanted just to mention briefly, since we're still on the subject of the U.S.-Mexico drug war, and one other quick thing before I even mention that.
Well, who are the insurgents in
Ferguson? Oh, right, exactly. It's another thing we haven't addressed yet.
That's the thing is the military gets these one-size-fits-all solutions. They just get sort of these cookbooks, and the popular cookbook now is Petraeus and its counterinsurgency from 2006. And so they take this one-size-fit-all lens, and they're saying, okay, well, rebels in Iraq, those are insurgents. Okay, that makes some sense. But now we're going to say cartels are insurgents. And now we're going to view people in Ferguson as insurgents. And we're going to use counterinsurgency doctrine, which heavily includes surveillance. Because if you want to know which insurgents to help and which insurgents to hurt, then you need a lot of intelligence and surveillance telling you which groups are which, and which population in the U.S. belong to which quote-unquote insurgency groups. And so that explains a lot of the U.S. intelligence community surveillance and Five Eyes spying and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reality of it is that the U.S. intelligence community, they can't have any clue of what the hell is going on with all these insurgent who belongs to which and which group is which. I mean, you got to have some really. We hear all about the NSA has all these fantastic powers, and they do, but it's still run by people making mistakes and using algorithms that make mistakes. There was an incident where, again, this gets back to local police departments being militarized. I think it was LAPD that's got a. I think they call it crime Poll or something like predictive policing.
Right.
It's got this software tool, and
Yeah.
they try to use this intelligence, like the criminals or insurgents, and say, well, we're going to predict, which place is going to get robbed next, and they have this map set up, and they predict which areas, and that's just a really stupid way to go about it. Because if you really wanted to solve the problem, you would go to those areas that are showing up on the map, and you say, well, what's the real problem here? Is it people breaking in, or is it that the community here is impoverished and they need better education and they need better jobs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, and so based on this policy, what the answer leads us to is that the insurgents are us. It's the American people who are the targets of these operations. Right. And in fact, I'm reminded, because you mentioned the NSA and surveillance and such, and I'm reminded of things that Michael Hayden have said in the past. I believe Keith Alexander even echoed this, that the next terrorists are anonymous, the next terrorists are these activists online. And so we see this sort of rhetoric already. And we've seen sort of the training manuals that the Army and the Pentagon have as far as who qualifies as a terrorist, and it is so vague, and it actually I think it even lists people who if you talk about the Constitution too much, if you talk about civil rights too much, you could be a terrorist yourself. They could be coming after someone like that, and it's very it's disturbing, but I guess it's something that's happening right now as we speak. This sort of shift in the war on terror and war on drugs melding in a way, but to target our domestic population.
And a part of the problem is the counterinsurgency lens is so bad, and all the predictive software is so erroneous in its theory, that they go after the wrong people. Every so often, there's a leak of keywords that some fusion center or some police department is searching, and they have all these things on there, like they'll have something that makes sense, some big popular Twitter anonymous accounts, and then they'll have like the word popcorn. So they've got like all this intelligence, focusing on people, where's the popcorn? We're speaking about popcorn. And so it's really screwball, and that's part of the problem, because then you get the wrong people who aren't even doing anything wrong, arrested, who are just eating popcorn.
So you know what? Actually, on that point, could you elaborate a little bit on the Fusion Center here in Austin, Texas, where I currently live? Because this comes up in your article that we referenced earlier on WhoWhatWhy, the Border Security Operations Center and the Border Operations Sector assessments that have come out of here. That part of the data is something that you're going through right now, looking into as far as what is actually going on here to kind of piece stuff together. But could you talk a little bit about, before we get into the data itself, but perhaps a little bit about what this center is and what it does and why it's there?
Well, the Fusion Centers are the Department of Homeland Security entities that are in each state, and they they put together intelligence from separate sources. So all this bad intelligence, like popcorn, is coming into the Fusion Center, and they fuse it into intelligence products that are supposed to make sense, and then they provide those up to higher level authorities to make decisions based on them about where to send, the paramilitary police. This hasn't, it may have really happened in Ferguson, I'm sure it did. It must have. That's the only real explanation, is that's how they would do it, I mean, we don't have leaks from the, Missouri Fusion Center, I don't think, but that's the blueprint. That's how they would do it. So in the case of the Border Security Operations Center, that's a Texas State Police entity, not a DHS Fusion Center, but it's very similar. They take these inputs from the outlying offices of the Border Security Operations Center, and you've got one in El Paso, for example, that's actually housed in the El Paso Police Department. And they've got sort of Fusion Center-y named thing there as well. So so you got this El Paso Police Department that's doing double duty as a sort of nerve ending of the Border Security Operations Center. So the El Paso one there it funnels up the intelligence it's gathering to the Austin-based Border Security Operations Center, which then puts together the intelligence products called Border Operations Sector Assessments. And those have, the key events and findings from the El Paso sector and the Marfa sector and the Laredo sector, and they've got the statewide corridor seizures, and they've got the significant events in Mexico. There's actually one that was published on November 4, 2011, a Border Operations Sector Assessment, which has got, you were mentioning Anonymous, and it actually has Anonymous in this document. It was a key event and finding of the Law Enforcement Sensitive Controlled Unclassified Information Border Operations Sector Assessment that was obtained by WikiLeaks. And one of the key events and findings that's on page 2 is the online hacker collective Anonymous has decided to take on Mexico's most violent drug cartel, Los Zetas, by exposing the name of Zetas linked police officers, officials, and journalists for allegedly kidnapping an anonymous member in a protest in the state of Veracruz. And they've got like a few pages describing what happened there. It's got a picture of the Guy Fawkes mask and everything.
Yeah.
That actually connected with Op Cartel and Sarah Brown's case.
Could you remind me how that turned out? So I think, was that with the hostage or the kidnappee was eventually returned and the op was called off? Is that eventually what happened? As the Border Operations Sector Assessment notes, that there were a lot of conflicting, web page reports and YouTube videos and Twitter feeds. And my sources and my understanding say that yes, the Op Cartel stuff was real. There was some really wild stuff going on, and Barrett Brown was involved in promoting it and then not promoting it, and they were trying to decide, this is crazy. We've got a bunch of Anons trying to take on Zetas, who are by far they're ex-special forces, or they were formed from the Mexican special forces. Yeah. So it was a kind of a controversy, and it led to Brown being raided the first time, and people didn't believe it, because some of the legal documents were sealed and so on. Gotcha. Right. Well, let's talk about this then. What about the sort of data that's coming out now? Is there anything that you can share with us now as far as potential future information that may develop here that's worth knowing about? And also, curiously, I'm also curious about I saw the presentation you had over at the HopeX conference. And you talk about how Stratfor ended up with this data, with this information. So that's a story in itself that maybe you can share with our audience here. So tell us about that. And also, while we're at it, tell us about how that Hope Conference and all that went as well.
Okay, so again, I was talking about the El Paso outlying office. They, and specifically a U.S. border liaison officer named Lloyd Shook, who was codenamed by Stratfor US 1301. I'm going to double check that real quick, but I think it was US 1301. Stratfor would codename its sources, but the WikiLeaks search engine is so good at searching through the Stratfor documents that you can reverse engineer and figure out, who sent the email that was ultimately codenamed US 1301. You look and it's this guy Lloyd Shook from a Texas DPS email address. So he's sending these border operations sector assessments over to Stratfor. Stratfor analyst named Victoria J. Allen, who formerly worked at the Border Security Operations Center as an Abrams Learning and Information Systems contractor, putting together the border operations sector assessments. So this woman goes from the Border Security Operations Center to Stratfor and starts obtaining for Stratfor the intelligence documents, and she subsequently left Stratfor. And she's doing private, spying stuff somewhere else. Right. So while she goes over to Stratfor, she's like, "Hey, let's get some of these documents from my old colleagues." And so now Stratfor has them, and that's how ultimately WikiLeaks wound up with them.
Gotcha.
So it's interesting because you can go through these border operation sector assessments and also find all sorts of information that's worth getting out of FOIA, using FOIA requests to search for, and hoping to, with Project PM, make maps and visualizations and all sorts of ProPublica style data-driven journalism out of these border operations sector assessments, and then build stories that are more enjoyable and put things into context and analyze clearer for Who What Why readers, what all this data means.
Exactly, and that's exactly where I was going to next, actually, with Project PM.
And I double-checked, and the Stratfor source was indeed codenamed US1301.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Now, so do talk a little bit more about that, though, Project PM, and what the work that you're doing with them or through them to piece this sort of stuff together, and perhaps anyone who's listening to this podcast now, what they could potentially do to aid in that effort.
Right. Okay, so Project PM was started by the jailed journalist Barrett Brown, whom I've been reporting on for Who What Why. His case, his whole saga. He initially actually was really into skeptic community and looking at how to improve skepticism. He was kind of like the ultimate sort of high school debate captain who would was really big into sort of atheism and skeptical reasoning. And he started Project PM as an idea of how to improve just the media's knowledge and information in the media in general. And that very quickly for him turned into working with Anonymous and all these leaked emails about private spy contractors. So he gets raided, and the search warrant actually specifically named the Project PM domain.
Yeah.
So that's where I stuck the border operations sector assessments with. We've got a page there called the 2011 Texas Border Security Intelligence Products, where we're putting more of these from the outlying offices, and we've got the BOSAs as well. That's where we're organizing and putting all. Hopefully, eventually, going to have the maps and so forth. So what the way audience members could help is, we have the PDF files listed there on Project PM, and they can sort through these things, and they can say, hey, this is interesting, and tweet at Project PM, PROJPM, or tweet at me, Douglas Lucas, LUCS, and be like, hey, this is a really cool thing. Why don't you do a FOIA request on this, or why doesn't Who What Why do a story on this? Because there are thousands of pages of these border operations sector assessments. And there's enough data in there to make a million stories. So it's not like we're suddenly going to lose an exclusive or something, because there's just so much quantity of stuff, just like the Stratfor emails, that you put a lot of work into these stories, and that's great. But combining forces with it's great when Who What Why commenters bring additional material to the story, or when Project PM Twitter people bring additional information, and we work together as a commons, and we put it together a narrative at a place like Who What Why, where the editors have decades of experience in national security reporting, and so they can take sort of the info that very enthusiastic but less experienced people find, and help put it into stories that are into context and connect to global and national information about natural resources that corporations are going after, such as the pipeline in the Ukraine. The story Who What Why did on that.
Indeed.
So it's about we have these mega leaks coming out from organizations such as WikiLeaks, and there's so much data in them that it requires a crowd to go through them and pick out cool things and forward them up to journalists such as myself, who can then work with editors such as the ones at Who What Why, who have the sort of the theoretical and the historical knowledge to put all the raw bits of data into context.
Exactly. And working with open source intelligence, it's great. I think it's fantastic, and so
and it scares the bejesus out of the
I'm sure it
US
does.
government.
I mean, I'm not, I am sure it does, and we have evidence that it does. In the Barrett Brown case, is evidence of that it does scare the bejesus out of them, because they will react violently to those that try to do these sorts of things and put this sort of stuff together. So, which is why it's important to continue that effort. I think it's a great thing that you're doing through Project PM. And so again, just that website for folks who might have missed it, it's wiki.project-pm.org, and I'm sure the link will be added to any of the show notes that we have for this podcast, so you guys can access that easily to get to it. One final thing, to leave off on a sort of a lighter note, at least potentially a lighter note, because we're not sure exactly what happened yet. You're trying to figure this out, but while you were at the HOPEX conference, your phone was hacked, wasn't it? So what happened to that, man? What's up with your phone? Is it okay?
Well, we did the Project PM panel, and we actually got surveilled. We had there were some reporters and some people in the audience who fed back information to Project PM about what exactly happened during our panel, and that was that there were some people up near the front row who were using a telephoto lens to get high quality photographs of our faces, and they were sort of laughing at moments where I mentioned stuff from my Stratfor research, and they laughed at and made a strong effort to record this LinkedIn tool that scrapes Project PM uses to scrape data off of LinkedIn and make visualizations of maps about how these secret spies work together, because all these secret spies publish all their stuff, all these secret things on LinkedIn as advertising. That's actually Splendid Spoon. That's her Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Lauren Pespisa, who's doing that LinkedIn tool called the Transparency Toolkit. But anyway, so our Project PM panel got surveilled by these strange folks, and we're still trying to figure out who they are. And then, like, the next day it was that I was in the vendor booth area, and this is sort of vendor in scare quotes because these are a bunch of nonprofits with donation jars selling T-shirts, like the Rise Up Collective and the Free Software Foundation. So I'm hanging out with them, and all of a sudden my phone gets hacked. I'm looking at it, and it's screenshot taken, screenshot taken, screenshot taken, because the hacker is trying to figure out how to unroot my phone so they can grab control and access over it. All these prompts and menus kept popping up out of my phone like the hands of a monster climbing out to get me. Probably what it was not the people surveilling our Project PM panel. Probably what it was some hacker at the Hope conference just screwing around, maybe with a device similar to a Stingray, which impersonates a cell phone tower. Like maybe they were like demoing it to their friend or something, and that happened to catch my phone, But it could be anything. It really could be anything. So it could have been those people surveilling the panel, or it could have been, who knows who it was. And so what I actually did was I ripped the battery out of my phone while this was happening. Actually, I showed it to the person behind the Free Software Foundation booth, who of all people on the planet, there is going to be able to know. And they're like, "Yep, your phone's getting hacked," and like she thought it was kind of the most ordinary thing in the world, the phone's getting hacked. So I ripped the battery out, and then I had to keep the battery out of my phone for 3.5 weeks before the systems engineer here in North Texas became available to image my phone. It's a very difficult process to get an image out of the root system that's on the phone without an SD card, sort of the firmware out of there. And I wanted to make sure that I had a guy skilled enough to do it. And we actually videotaped the whole imaging process.
Really? Okay.
So we got objective evidence of how we did that. And so it wound up that I've now got, a file, DAL, my initials, DAL phone, .tar.gz.jpg, GPG. It's an encrypted file that I have that I'm working with forensics people to get them that encrypted file of my phone image, and then get them the passphrase to the file so they can decrypt it and analyze and do forensics on it and figure out what malware is on that phone and exactly what happened, what evidence they can find. So that's taking some while. I'm looking for some forensics volunteers to help me do that, because I'm trying to do everything by the book. It's kind of funny. You get a lot of it's sort of like, how you have teenagers play guitar, and you have a lot of them who brag about how great they are at guitar, and they never practice. Well, you get a lot of so-called hackers who are busy bragging about which encryption algorithm is the coolest, but they really don't sit there and work on their skills. So it's a little bit challenging sometimes to find out, like, hey guys, like, I'm the guy you're always talking about, a freelance journalist who's working with WikiLeaks. I've got a problem with my phone getting hacked. Like, maybe you should stop talking about helping with those things and like actually do it. It's sort of like maybe the teenager should practice his guitar instead of talking at Guitar Center about how cool he is. And it's the same phenomenon. But yeah, I got some forensics people I can hook up with. I was actually just sort of like doing it as an experiment to see if anybody on Twitter would find my pinned tweet about this and sort of deduce that I needed a forensics person. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to look at how many days that's taking, and then go back and find how many people are bragging about being able to do that, who follow me and read my
cross analysis, yeah.
So it's just sort of a goofy thing that I'm doing with this in order to, I'm making a teachable moment, an example out of my situation, which probably was some hacker goofing
could have
off
been
and screwing around, but you never know.
Yeah, you never do, man. So no, you'll have to let us know how this turns out, because I'm actually interested to see what ended up happening here.
That's something I'm doing for the crypto sphere, but it'll definitely share it around. People can
we'll find it on your Twitter and whatnot. So actually, before we do close out, just briefly mention anything else you'd like to add. Feel free, but do mention where folks listening can check out more of what you do, not just on Who What Why, but maybe your personal site, your Twitter handle, stuff like that, so people can keep track of what you're up to.
The best way is just to watch my Twitter feed. That's where I post the latest things I'm thinking or reading or whatever. And that's simply twitter.com/Douglas Lucas, LUCAS. And then you can also check douglaslucas.com, and you can find a news section on that first page showing my latest articles, or you can look at douglaslucas.com/nonfiction, which has got all my latest articles, and Who What Why is there at the top. Everything I've done for Who What Why is the first thing you'll see, and you can find my Who What Why articles there, and then below that are articles at other venues.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for joining us here, Douglas. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, for sure. It's been great to talk to you. It's been a really good conversation. I want to thank you and thank the audience for tuning in to this very first episode of this Radio Who podcast. Again, very, very much appreciate you guys tuning in and downloading this podcast. Come back and join us next time. And until then, this has been your host, Guillermo Jimenez, reminding you, as always, that on this grand chessboard, it is we the people who are now in check. It is our move. Thanks for listening.